Hey y'all, this is True Historian, and my name is Sean Browning, and I'm going to talk about the assassination of Abraham Lincoln and the attempted coup d'etat slash real insurrection on April 14th, 1865. And we all know that John Wilkes Booth killed Lincoln, but he actually had about at least 40 other co-conspirators, but 9 others were co-masterminds of this orchestrated insurrection attempt. And there may have been others. Now, shortly after the April 9th surrender, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at the Appomattox Courthouse. And Lincoln's speech shortly after the Union victory and the end of the war, in which Lincoln promised to grant voting rights for all former slaves and all blacks, whether they were already previously free or recently freed from the slavery as it was ending. Now, around that time when Lincoln made that speech, John Wilkes Booth, who happened to hear it from the crowd that was waiting outside the White House, when Lincoln gave that address off the balcony of the second floor of the White House, was overheard or quoted saying that would be the last speech that monkey gave, which is what he said in the speech. But yeah, you get my drift. And that speech prompted Booth to move up his attempt at an insurrection and the planned assassinations of Lincoln, the Secretary of State William Seward, and the Vice President Andrew Johnson, and who knows what else they planned. But those three were supposed to be simultaneous attacks. Booth kills Lincoln, and at the same time, one of his other guys now chickens out from attempting to assassinate Andrew Johnson and decides rather to get drunk than go and try and kill Johnson at Johnson's hotel, which they had already previously scouted. And then 2 guys were sent to, one being a guide and the other to attack William Seward, and managed to attack Seward after getting access into the house under the guise of delivering medicine for the bedridden, full body cast wearing William Seward, who was still recovering from a accident involving his carriage. Now, during the attack on William Seward, the daughter sees what's happening and she screams, the daughter of William Seward, and one of her brothers decides to wrestle with and try and tackle the assailant. However, at some point, the assailant flees, but he gets lost in the city without his guide, who had already fled, and would be picked up at the stoop of where he was staying days later, after wandering throughout the city by the Washington, D.C. police, which was a small department back then. Now, if you're asking why Abraham Lincoln was not protected well, the answer is there was no plan in action for protecting the president. The war was over, so the obligation for the military to protect the president was not enacted, so it wasn't fully necessary. However, the Secret Service had not been created. In fact, it was a proposal and Abraham Lincoln had in his final days to create a Secret Service to protect the president. And the contract involving the Pinkerton boys to protecting the president was now over. So you didn't have them. The only bodyguard supposedly Lincoln had was the major, who was a special guest or an invitee of the Lincolns with his fiance, and there were a few other soldiers, and then there was a cop who was supposed to be on duty, but had left his post shortly before Booth came into the press box, the president's box. Well, he had left to have lunch or wherever, and then Booth came in, and we all know what happened there. He shot the president, wrestled with the major, slid down the bank, whatever, jumped from the balcony onto the stage, injured his foot, but yelled "Death to the Tyrant" before fleeing off horseback into Northern Virginia, where later on he would die in a shootout with the 16th New York Cavalry, among other units that were there that cornered him in that farm in Northern Virginia. The other conspirators, 9 of them, would later be tried under a military tribunal, the first time and probably the only time in the U.S. history in which we tried civilians on a military tribunal or court-martial, because D.C. was still under a martial law at that time, which meant military rule. Now, they would all be sentenced. The 9 would be sentenced to death by hanging, and would be later hung at an old arsenal in D.C. And even though one of them, the woman, Miss Mary Stewart, who was the wife of another co-conspirator, and they both owned the boarding house in which Booth and his other co-conspirators were staying, as well as property in Maryland, which had a whole arsenal or cache of weapons. So, in other words, they really planned to not only just assassinate the President Lincoln, but they tried to fully overtake or overthrow the whole government and the current administration by taking out some of the key leaders in the administration, to strike fear in the others in order to control said other leaders at the time. However, that was not the case. It all failed, backfired, and the only thing that was successful in John Wilkes Booth's insurrection attempt and coup d'etat was the fact that he killed Lincoln. Now, but I'm going to go on in other videos about the other 3 assassinations and how Secret Service came to be what we know today. But thank you guys. Please let me know what you guys think. And if you want to know the more information on the names, the co-conspirators, you can Google or Wikipedia the assassination attempt on Abraham, the assassination on Abraham Lincoln. It's true historian. And y'all have a great one. God bless y'all.